to see that type of long-term thinking and that sort of awareness that we can't allow a Brazilian-owned company and a Chinese-owned company to be our largest producer of chicken, pork, and beef and lamb. We need to have those large. We needed those to be companies that are United States companies that are, focused on not just the bottom line, but also our nation's health, like our nation's survival. And there are things more important than money. A lot of things, actually.
I'm Carson Jorgensen. And this is the Carson Jorgensen Podcast. Hey everybody, one of the questions I get most often asked in agriculture is, how do we find your food? How do we find local products? How do we connect to farmers or ranchers near us and buy directly from them? Crofter.com. Guys, the folks at Crofter have been working on this marketplace to be able to get food from the local producers to you, the consumers. It's a direct line from farm to table. Visit Crofter.com for more information on how you can get high quality food delivered directly to your home or pick it up straight from the farm. Again, that's Crofter.com. Today I have a special guest with me as we continue this series talking about agriculture in America. Graham Meriwether, he's out with the people. He's been around the country. He's filmed a lot of documentaries and spoken with a lot of farmers and ranchers across the country. You may or may not have heard of some of them. His first one was American Meat, and the second one coming out here pretty soon is Farmers for America. Graham, thanks for joining me today, man.
It's a pleasure, Carson. Glad to be here.
We've had technical difficulties all morning, so I'm sure glad we are finally able to get on here and have this discussion. It's almost like somebody doesn't want us to have this talk. But so Graham, do you want to tell everybody a little bit about yourself? Because I could never do it justice.
Sure, of course. I am a documentary filmmaker, and now I'm a homesteader. But basically, ever since the early 2000s, I've been really passionate about agriculture and farming issues. And so the way that looked for me was I worked on a farm for a little bit with one of my friends. And I also read a book that a lot of people read called The Omnivore's Dilemma. And that book really impacted me deeply, in large part because Joel Salatin was in that book. And so I sent an email to Joel. I think it was in the spring of 2006. So that's how long I've been on this journey. But I spent a year filming with Joel on Polyface and Daniel and the whole Salatin family. And that was a really wonderful experience, just to see a farm that is so deeply integrated into the ecosystem where it is. For those of you that aren't, I'm sure most of you are familiar with Polyface, but it's a really special place. And then there was another thing that happened in my first film, American Meat, that really changed me, which was one of the things Joel does is talk about some of the problems that we have in, I guess, quote unquote, conventional agriculture. And so he was talking about how in some of those barns, you have animals that aren't in very good situations. Obviously, that's his opinion and his perspective, being a grass-based local farmer. And so I was living in New York City, and I did what I think most documentaries have done, which is I sent an email to PETA and I said, hey, could you send me some stock footage from they had a video called Meet Your Meat. And so they sent me a bunch of tapes that had all of this, hidden camera footage of conventional farms. And I started editing it into my film, but something didn't feel right. I felt like this wasn't real journalism. And so I spent the next 2 years driving around the country and actually filming with large-scale chicken farmers, hog farmers, cattle raisers. And it completely changed my perspective. I realized that, the people who are raising chickens for Purdue and Pilgrim's Pride and raising hogs for Smithfield and Murphy, they're good people. A lot of them are just stuck in a system that they feel the only way they can keep their farm going is to sign these really abusive contracts that a lot of the multinationals are putting out to people. And so I presented my first film, American Meat, as a very balanced film that was showing, the upsides of the local food movement and also the advantages of the conventional side. So it was a film that I befriended like the president of the Iowa Pork Producers Association, Rich Degner. It was a film where a conventional farmer could watch it and not want to punch me in the face, essentially. Uh, and then my next film, which is Farmers for America, that's all about young farmers, and was very incredibly humbled that Mike Rowe narrated that film, and we had a lot of wonderful screenings across the country, and it had a 3-year run on PBS, and so I've spent, yeah, basically I've almost been 20 years now just going around the country filming with farmers. This is my full-time job, and so I definitely have gotten to see a lot of different places and a lot of different philosophies and a lot of different farms. So it's been an honor and something I'm very lucky to have been a part of and still be a part of.
And that's what I appreciate about your approach. Like I say, for my family, it's always been kind of a taboo thing to talk to documentary folks, and I'm sure you've run into that with a bunch of the farmers and ranchers because they're used to this gotcha journalism where everybody's out to get them, and everybody's trying to spin the story how they want to spin the story, and a lot of people are very leery about that, especially farmers and ranchers in the day and age we live in with social media and how fast and how bad things can turn for a family really quick. And so, like I say, I very much appreciate the way that you approach this. And you brought up something there that I think is pretty important because a lot of people on the conventional side of agriculture won't often talk about it. And it's in our quest for cheap food, we have created some processes that probably are not the best. But you have 1% of people now feeding the rest of the entire planet. And so they've had to grow and they've had to get bigger. But you said something in there that I think is so important for people to understand. The big multinational packers, those giant corporations that are forcing people into these contracts that have gone in and bought out the infrastructure to be able to put farmers and ranchers and family farms in these situations. I mean, this is not an easy solution. And everybody says, oh, it just needs to be all natural and grass fed. And guys, there's nothing better. But we've gotten to the point where that's not really possible to be able to feed the rest of the country at the moment. And so we've got ourselves between a rock and a hard place. And again, that's what I always say. In the quest for cheap food, we have created some processes that probably are not the greatest. And you're starting to see a lot of people in conventional agriculture figure that out. That you know what, we have made some mistakes. And they're starting to open up their minds and they're starting to admit that. But going down that line of thinking, you've traveled around the country, you've seen it. We can talk about the problems all day, but I mean, what do you see and what do you feel is a solution to this system? Because we still have to feed people, we still have to feed all these Americans, we still have to feed a lot of the world, really. So how do we find that balance between the really natural end of it and yet still having to produce en masse to be able to feed people?
It's a very difficult question. I think if I were able to wave a magic wand tomorrow and be in control of America's agriculture, I would do two things. First of all, I would get government regulation and subsidies out of the American food system. So, what that looks like is either eliminating or significantly downsizing the United States Department of Agriculture. And the reason I would do that is because there's been what's called regulatory capture, right? So you have the people that are representing America have been captured by the multinational companies. One of the most glaring examples of that, it comes with the country of origin labeling situation, in which 90% of Americans want to know the country that their food comes from. I think it might even be a higher number than that. And so we were able to pass legislation to put um, labels to let people know which country it came from. And then basically the large meat packers, in this particular case, JBS, led the way decided that that was not good for their bottom line, because the way that JBS makes money is that they arbitrage the cheapest meat from around the world and they sell it into the highest profit market, which would be the United States. And so for them, if they have to put that something was raised in Mexico or Brazil, that's going to mess up their market, and people aren't going to want to buy it if there's a product that says it's raised in the United States. So what they did was they bought off a bunch of politicians and were able to get the country of origin labeling killed. And after it was done, and John Boehner was the Speaker of the House during that time, he was placed as a board member for JBS after he retired. And I don't
Funny
want,
how that works, isn't it?
yeah, I mean, now I don't want to, John Boehner, I don't know him, and he's probably a good guy that cares a lot about his kids and his family, but that's the system that we have right now, which is essentially it's you get you get bought by the large companies. And so you asked about solutions, and I was talking about problems. So the solutions would be, like I said, to downsize the USDA, to get regulations out of things, to get subsidies out of the way. And this is not going to be a popular sentiment with a lot of farmers, but
Oh, sure.
if I was in charge of things, I would get rid of ethanol tomorrow, right? It would be,
100%.
you would stop subsidizing. That is the exact opposite of capitalism. In fact, that's communism. What you have with ethanol, you have a fake market that's been created by the government, literally by the government, that's been subsidized by the government and put into gasoline, which actually makes those engines run less well and is worse for the environment than if you were just with gasoline. So everything about it is crony capitalism, and it's really destroying our food supply. Um, so the solutions would be, I'm a really big believer in regional food systems. And so that's sort of in between what you would see at the micro scale, where you have like, urban gardens and things like that, which are obviously never going to feed any large volume of people, but they're not as big as the huge centralized systems that are focused on, feeding many millions of people. And the reason I would try, so I would downsize those or incentivize having something in the middle, where you have, instead of having like 4 or 5 meat packing plants that produce most of the meat in America, you would have something like 60 to 80 or 80 to 100. And I'd obviously have to do a lot of research and learn a lot more. But
Sure, sure.
essentially, the idea is that instead of having one big centralized food system or a couple of big centralized spots, you break that up so that you're decentralizing. And you would still have scale, but the other thing I would say is, the only way this is really going to work is if we have a lot more farmers as well. So, like you bring
Sure.
up, that's such an important point, the 1%, that is not a sustainable situation. And we're not going to be in existence as a thriving country if we continue down that path. A country that can't feed itself is in very serious danger, and so we're not there yet, but we will be there in a couple decades if we don't change the route. Yeah.
But I mean, as of 2019, we became a net importer of food. I mean, we rely heavily on imports right now to feed our country, and that was a big thing that affected the sheep industry. And honestly, that's how you and I met, was talking about that back in the COVID era. But but you look at what's happening in our country. I believe the average age, if I'm not mistaken, of farmers and ranchers in this country is 62 years old. I think that is the average age. And you know what? Every one of them tells their kids, go find a job that's better than this. Go do something different, because you won't make a living doing it, and you can't survive. The average farmer, as of the last agricultural census, is $1.7 million in the debt. I mean, they cannot continue to sustain at this. I mean, right now we're seeing prices in industries in agriculture that were the same as what they were. I mean, look at corn this year. Look at lamb. Look at all of them. They are the same as what we were seeing in the late 70s and early 80s, back when a truck cost $2,500 to $8,000, somewhere in that range. Now a truck's $90,000, but yet the commodities prices are exactly the same as what they were in the 70s and the 80s. So you tell me how we can continue to sustain this, because I don't see a path. because something has to change. The regulatory capture, again, like you said, we are being forced with regulations from the federal government. I believe that is key. We have to downsize the Department of Agriculture, roll back regulations. But the only thing I see coming out of DC and the Farm Bill right now is more regulation, and more regulation. That's the only thing I see that's good, that's coming out of it. And it's not good.
Yeah.
The other thing is we have to make it sustainable for people to be able to afford to live. I mean, farmers and ranchers have to be able to stay on their place because, again, you talk about the ethanol subsidies and what damage that does to the rest of the industries. We have to make it. I mean, Europe, they learned the hard way. I mean, they remember World War II when people couldn't eat, and they have put a lot of emphasis into agriculture. And I don't necessarily mean subsidies, but we have to roll back those regulations, and we have to make it easier for people to stay on their places because nobody's going to do it. These young people, they can't do it, and their parents are telling them not to, and it becomes a generational curse that is now like, I don't want anything to do with it. Because I mean, think of, I mean, I want to put some people in these young ranchers' shoes, these young farmers. It's like you see your parents and your family, they're on average $1.7 million in debt, knowing that that's what you're going to take over and that you're going to work every day of your life and you're not going to make a dent in that, and it's just going to continue to get worse. Tell me how that sounds like a good idea. I mean, farmers and ranchers right now, the suicide rate amongst them is 3.5 times the average population right now. I mean, they're struggling, and people, I mean, they depend on them 3 times a day, and people don't understand that. I think the other big thing is imports. I mean, we are getting overrun with cheap and inferior food. You touched on MCOOL, mandatory country of origin labeling. The beef industry is a huge one. Again, these multinational corporations, the big packers, they're buying off the lobbyists, they're buying off the people at the top, and they're using that money to push down their agenda and make sure that their doors stay open. I mean, during COVID, prime example, we couldn't get cattle here in the United States processed through a processing plant. We had a backlog of about 500,000 head that we couldn't get processed. But what do? We go and import beef for the first time ever from Africa, from Namibia. We bring them in during COVID. Tell me how that makes any sense. Right now, our government, everybody thinks I'm crazy, but our government currently sends money to other countries to help them develop and build their businesses down there in these third world countries, to then turn around and send agricultural products back to the United States. So we are paying other countries to undercut agriculture in the United States. Tell me how that works. Because right now, I mean, use the sheep industry, and people are going to get tired of hearing me say this, but right now, 76% of lamb and mutton consumed in the United States comes from a different country. We had 56 million sheep in the United States prior to World War II. Now we have 5 million. Consumption's on the rise. People are eating it more and more. But guess what? That void is being filled with meat from other countries. And so this goes back to a huge, I mean, it's a multifaceted problem that's going to be a long time to solve. But I think having these conversations about it and getting out and doing exactly what you're doing, showing the country what both sides of the story look like. So as you've been out there, I'm sure you're seeing it, that these multinational corporations are making it hard on these family farms. Can people survive on their own, pulling away from these? I know you're starting to see a lot of farm to table movement. You're starting to see people sell direct to consumers. What are you seeing, and what do you think is the next step for a lot of people?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the future is in smaller farms, and I do think it's going to be different for every region. I mean, I currently live in Vermont, and Vermont is sort of, I mean, the farming here is hurting just like everywhere else, but it is, I would say, in a uniquely good position compared to most of the other places I've been around the country, largely because there's just so many small farms here. And so when you go to a restaurant, it's almost always the food is sourced from a farm that's nearby. The farmers markets are absolutely thriving. There's just all kinds of innovation and enthusiasm around growing food for your community in this very small state. Now, part of that is because of the geography of Vermont. It's a very mountainous area, and so it doesn't lend itself well to large scale grain production. And so you're kind of forced to either, have like terraced vegetable production or pigs or chickens or
Sure.
cows that are not as amenable to, that can survive in a hillier area. So it's things are definitely interesting in this state, and then across the country. Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, look, I honestly don't think we can survive if we keep the current system of agriculture. I mean, if you look at
Yeah.
like a place like Iowa, for instance, where I have spent a lot of time because a lot of the farmers from my first two films are in Iowa, and are we part of the way that I've been able to stay in business as an independent filmmaker is I sell my films directly to people, and so I get on the road and I rent out theaters and sell tickets, and I don't go the I've never applied to a film festival with any of my films. I premiere at agricultural conferences, and I sell my films directly to farmers and people care about food issues. Um, and so I've spent a lot of time in Iowa doing screenings for FFA chapters and high schools and Iowa State, University of Iowa, probably every University of Northern Iowa. Anyways, and I've done that a lot all around the country. But in Iowa, for instance, you have a situation where I talk to farmers and they say, well, when I was a kid, we had a four row cultivator, and so we had X number of farms on 160 acres, or we had a farm every 160 acres. And then now you talk and they're like, oh, I've got a 16-row cultivator. I and you just do the math there. That's four times less people. That's four
Sure.
times less school districts. That's four times less hardware stores. That's four times less grocery stores. And so you can't continue to grow and grow because guess what? Here's the dirty secret. It's not really a secret, but here's the goal of that type of farming. It's based only on money, right? It's not
Sure.
based
It's
on
efficiencies.
yeah. And so what is going to be the efficiency? I'll tell you right now, if you're a farmer, conventional farmer who's trying to get bigger or get out, eventually it's going to leave America. And here's why.
Yeah.
Because we cannot compete with having a place where the cost of living is 100 times cheaper or more than it is here.
Bingo.
And so that they're going to do is the business model is essentially to get all of the food production out of America, just like we got most of our manufacturing out of America. And you're going to have a scenario where we're depending upon China, Brazil, lots of different countries that we're going to be dependent upon, like you mentioned, Namibia, to feed our country, and that is a very dangerous situation to be in because I mean, you look at I have some Irish blood. You look at the potato famine. If you're not in control of your food supply, you get cut off if there's the slightest problem.
I
And
mean,
so,
but look what's happening, and that's not even a past problem. I mean, look what's happening in Ukraine right now. When you get instabilities like that, I mean, Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe for sure, and if not most of that entire continent. I mean, they feed Northern Africa, they feed the Mediterranean, all through there. That is Ukraine, and look what's happening there. A little bit of global uncertainty, and there is no certainty of the going to be food on your table tonight. And that, to me, food security is national security. A country that can't feed itself can't defend itself. And to me, really isn't a country if you can't produce for yourself. And I think you're spot on that those efficiencies are driving it. I mean, the easiest way to cut your costs is to do more with less people. And so, I mean, you're seeing autonomous things come in, you're seeing drones, you're seeing all of this new agriculture, but it costs money and everything is getting more expensive, and yet the price isn't going up, and it's not keeping up with what it was. I mean, in the 70s, 80s, you're looking at $10,000, $15,000 for a tractor. Now you're talking 250, $300,000 for a tractor. That's just for the tractor itself. We're not talking about cultivators or corn planters or anything like that. We're just simply, I mean, by the time you've got a tractor and a corn planter and your fertilizer wagon rolling through the field at the same time, you're well over $1 million. I mean, sitting in that one piece of equipment. And so, yeah, we're between a rock and a hard place. And to me, yeah, efficiency plays a huge role in it. But as you said, and I think this is key for everybody to understand, we're being made to compete with other countries where the cost of living is next to nothing compared to what it is. The guys that we bring in here on our H2A visas to herd sheep, this is a great example of that. They're making here about 5 times what they would make down there a month. And I mean, we pay them decent and then we cover their housing and all that, but yet they're making 5 times a month here what they would be making down there. And that, I mean, most people down there are living on 4 or 5, $600 a month. Compared to here, you're talking 4 or 5, $6,000 a month. And so we're being made to compete with that, and it's not keeping up. Not only that, we're being made to compete in the regulations. We're being made to meet regulations that are not the same. I mean, everybody says, you talk to anybody USDA and you talk to people in Congress and they say, and I actually had this conversation with somebody from USDA at the national level, and they said, oh, if they're importing it to the United States, they're killing it the same standards and processing it the same standards that we are. And I said, okay, who's been down there to check? Do you have a USDA inspector on the floor at every one of those plants, or they're killing overseas, or are they killing them in their backyard and taking them to a central location and putting them on a boat? You have no idea. So stop lying to everyone. And that's why country of origin labeling is so important, because people need to be able to choose. And in the United States and American exceptionalism, we have a superior product that people ought to be able to know where that food comes from.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I mean, and to me, it's really about getting more people excited about farming. I feel like, because I do think we can get out of this. I don't think it's an impossible situation. I think what
Yeah.
needs to happen, a lot of things need to happen. Number one, a lot of people need to get really excited about growing food and farming. And so, one of the things I've started looking at, and so I do have a number of films that are in the pipeline about to come out. A couple of them actually, Carson, you're going to be in.
Yeah.
Those which is how I got out to see you and film with you. Um, but one of the films, actually, the newest film I'm working on, which I is called The Right to Food, and so that's a really interesting movement that's happening. And I think actually you were the one who told me about Wyoming, but there's two states in America that have done some really wonderful things
Yeah.
around food freedom and farm food freedom, and those states are Maine and Wyoming. And so a lot of people aren't aware that you can bake cookies for your neighbor and give them a batch of cookies, uh, and that's totally fine. The government doesn't, they don't want to regulate anything. They don't want to come in and watch over your shoulder to make sure that you put the proper ingredients in the cookies and all those things. However, if you were to decide that you wanted to sell a plate of cookies to your neighbor, suddenly every state would introduce an unbelievable amount of red tape, forms you have to fill out. They'd come in and tell you that you need to have $20,000 worth of new kitchen appliances, a separate bathroom, all of these types of regulatory hurdles that essentially make it impossible for people in rural America and people anywhere in America to start a small food business to supplement their income, or to start a craft business or a homestead business. And so there's this really exciting and wonderful thing that's happening in Maine and in Wyoming, where they've decided to get the government out of transactions. And so essentially, I'm really excited because I just yesterday I was talking to Jerry, who's this awesome guy in Maine who started something called the Sovereign Food Market. And it's the coolest thing ever. I don't know if you have you heard about this, Carson?
I haven't heard about this one.
Okay,
No.
it's so cool. So basically, and Craig Hickman, who's this amazing state senator in Maine that I filmed with, who helped pass the Maine Food Sovereignty Act. And so the Maine Food Sovereignty Act essentially said that you can eat whatever you want to eat. You can be control what you control what you put in your body, and you can also sell to your neighbor and do what you want without government intervention. And so once this law took many years to pass, but once it passed, now these all these really cool things are starting to happen. So an example of that is the um, the Stockholm sovereign market, and the Stockholm sovereign market is in it's like way up in the northernmost part of Maine, right next to the Canadian border, and it's a very rural area, as you might imagine. But essentially, there's a group of people that have decided to come together and start a market that has no government intervention. So it's like a farmers market, but it's actually a private club. And so every Saturday, people come together, and they have over 450 members. I think they have about 80 vendors, and this is in a very small, very rural area. And you sign a waiver. It's a $5 fee to get in. You sign a waiver, and you say, I will not sue anyone. I know that this basically, you say, I know this is unregulated food. I know the government hasn't looked into it. And you should see the Facebook group. I mean, the photos, it's every post has hundreds of likes. And we're talking about a small, a very
Yeah.
small area in rural
So is
Maine.
it a PMC? Is a private membership cooperative? Is that what it is?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know the exact legalities of it, but it's essentially, it operates like a farmer's market, except you cannot, when you show up, you have to say, they ask, are you a member? And then if you want to become a member, you have to sign a piece of paper and give them $5. But then
Yeah,
essentially they've been able to step out of the regulatory burden of the USDA and the state level as well, because of this Maine Food Sovereignty Act. And so, Wyoming has the Food Freedom Act, I believe it's called, which is very similar in nature. I believe it's slightly different in some ways. But I mean, to talk about something that would be an absolute huge growth opportunity for rural America and for the rest of America is, let's get the government out of small food regulations and businesses, so we can actually have, you could sell things to your neighbor without having a $20,000 upfront cost. You
sure.
could, all of these things start to become possible. And then, I think it you start, this is a very hard problem that we face right now, which you've alluded to. We're between a rock and a hard place. But I think the more things we can find, like, okay, here's a pocket where things are working. Okay, here's a pocket, here's a new idea that's gonna give people more freedom and get the government out of subsidizing things or things like that. I think once you tackle things where you can, then you start to get to a point where you start to get on the right path towards a solution.
Yeah. No, and it's funny you mentioned that, there's a group out here in Utah that's doing a similar thing, like you say, a private membership cooperative where it's like, hey, you can't do it. Utah here, we are working on legislation. I've been working with a group of people on legislation. Same thing. If it's raised, reared, and processed here in the state of Utah, you can sell it within the borders, and we can make our own interstate compacts with other states to trade around us. And I think that's a big part of where we go for here. I've also been working with another company, and they've sponsored quite a few episodes of this series of the War on Agriculture, and it's called Craft Their Market. And basically, what it is an online farmers market where you can find meat, eggs, whatever raised close to you based on your zip code. You can go pick it up. It can get shipped to you in the mail. It can be all of these things. And I mean, it's expanding these things and growing these interests. And there's a reason why I took interest in it, because I think there is merit to it, especially with the smaller farms and the more homesteads and croft type things. There's a lot of merit to it. The only problem I found with it is on the bigger end of it. These giant producers like my family and others, we run about 5,000 head of sheep. I mean, you've got other guys that are doing 2, 3, 4,000 head of cattle. It's a difficult thing to kind of get into the niche market game. It's because how do you process and sell on a scale? But then you see companies like Good Ranchers that are starting to sell direct to consumer, and a lot of ranches, Dealer Ranch, and those folks are they're going direct to consumer. And so people are starting to figure it out. They're starting to match the logistics and manage it. And I think you're going to see a lot of things in the near future that are very helpful along that way, because to me, it's all about decentralizing it and pulling that control away from the federal government and returning the choice to the people.
Because one thing that I think is very telling, and I as I've gone around the country and talked to a lot of places and talked to a lot of people and also been to a lot of conferences and things like that. One stat that keeps coming up again and again to me is like I heard it in Nebraska when I was at their a conference there. I heard it in Maine recently when I was talking to Senator Hickman. But essentially, most of these states don't produce like Nebraska imports, I think 90% of its food, and it's some of the most fertile land in America. Maine imports 90% of its food plus. And so you have this ridiculous situation, which I understand it's not like I understand how we got it, but if you think about it just from a purely logical standpoint, you have things being shipped all over the country to go, it gets raised here and then it gets shipped halfway across the country to have it processed here and then it gets shipped another halfway across the country there. It would make a lot of sense if Utah fed Utah. It would make a lot of sense if
Sure,
Nevada fed Nevada. It would make a lot of sense if Texas fed Texas. And like you said, we decentralize it and Maine feeds Maine. So that way you have a lot of domestic infrastructure for processing, for distribution. I mean, if you're at a Utah Jazz game, there's no reason you shouldn't have, lamb burgers from Jorgensen Farms on the menu there. It just makes sense, like on every level, right? Like it's like,
sure,
so that's really where I think we need to head. If we're going to have a regional successful agriculture, we need to start really thinking about, I'm not saying hyper local is probably not going to make sense, but at a state level, you could have each if you had if we flipped that on its head and we had 90% each state fed 90% of its food for those people, that would be a very healthy situation, and you would have a lot more jobs in agriculture. You'd have a lot more farmers because you would need to have more farmers to make that work. Um,
sure.
yeah,
But you alluded to it earlier, and I haven't talked about this with many people, but I think it's a fair point to make on this account is the hollowing out of rural America because of the movement of agriculture, and this bodes to that point right now is we could bring more farmers back, we could bring more work back. People could afford to hire somebody on the farm. People could afford their kids to stick around and actually have more than one child stay on the farm or the ranch and be able to diversify and grow that because we're hollowing out rural America because we are taking them jobs away. We're building houses over farms. We're doing all of those things that we shouldn't be doing because once agriculture is gone, it's gone. It's not like the rest of manufacturing where you could throw up a plant in 2 years and be back and producing. Once a house is built on agricultural ground, you're done. Once that farm is sold, it never comes back. And I think the statistic is we're losing 4 acres of farm ground every second in the United States. And I mean, how do we recover from that? Because it's gone. And so I think that bodes to another point. But again, going back to diversifying, yeah, there are things we're going to have to bring from somewhere else. Like we don't grow citrus fruits, we have a hard time. But why aren't we producing? And this is a question that I believe all the state legislatures, and this is where it gets really political. But I think that's where all the state legislators and the local governments need to look at each other and say, what are we doing to incentivize people to stay in agriculture? What are we doing to incentivize building that around here, putting the infrastructure in place? Utah's doing a pretty good job of it right now. They're adding in they call it an agri park. And they've just started construction and putting in the infrastructure. But what they're doing is putting the infrastructure there to be able to handle the processing later on, getting it outside of the city where nobody's going to complain about it. They're going to have it's going to be completely self-contained. They're going to provide water. They're going to provide sewage. They're going to provide steam. They're going to provide whatever they need to put in whatever type of agricultural processing facilities and really cutting that cost to help to break that up and again spread that out because most of the time that's what I see when it comes to agriculture is the inability to get it processed. It's not real hard to grow stuff. I mean, around here we used to grow snap peas. We used to have 2 pea vineries or just right across the street from my house was one. Had pea vineries. We had sugar beet processing. We had all kinds of stuff. We can grow it here. Problem is we can't get it to market. There's nowhere to get it cleaned up and packaged. We don't have any of the facilities to process these products anymore. So I think that's going to be a big part of it. And the states need to start looking into that, is what can we do as a state? What can we invest in as a state to put it into place, to not give a handout, but make it easy and accessible for people to put in processing to get these products to market later.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like when you go to a campground and you have a lake there, and then you have a little, you have a place you can process your fish.
Yeah.
We maybe have stuff like that for, that's almost part of like the local utility, where you would have, a place that farmers could use it if they wanted to process vegetables or to process meat and that type of thing. It makes a lot of sense for sure.
Yeah,
Uh,
because in Utah, we take a lot of flack because we produce so much alfalfa. But the reason why we continue to produce alfalfa, one, it's a pretty water wise crop. I mean, it grows a really deep taproot on it, can grow it. It's pretty dry. It grows extremely well here, and it's a really marketable thing. But the other thing is we have the ability to sell it here, and we have the processing to be able to move that commodity. Whereas if we had a pea vinery again, people could start growing snap peas. If we had a beet processor or a cane factory, I mean, in southern end of Utah, they used to grow sugar cane. They used to grow cotton here, but we
really,
don't anymore. Yeah, no, absolutely. Utah's Dixie. There's a reason they call it that. It's because they used to grow cotton in the south end of the state, and so we're losing that diversification, and we really become very specialized. And I think part of the answer, again, going forward, is to open that up. It is to put the facilities in place to be able to diversify agriculture again.
totally. Yeah, 100% agree. Yeah, yeah, and I think it's it's really about, like you said, working together. The one of the things, the storyline that we're going to tell in this next film called The Right to Food, with, you have Senator Craig Hickman, who's a Democrat, a progressive Democrat, and then you have uh, Billy Bob Fockingham, who is a Republican, conservative Republican, who's a lobsterman in Maine, and those two guys, who, on the surface you might say, well, how are they gonna agree on anything? But they were actually, them working with a dairy farmer, Heather Retberg. Those three people pretty much worked across the aisle in their way to get the legislation in front of a Republican governor, and got that signed, and that, got it passed. So, I think it's really about, food is beyond politics. It's
Sure.
beyond, it's pretty much the number, like you said, the number one thing we need to figure out. So I think as a country, we kind of just need to be like, all right, we have a lot of stuff that we disagree on, on various issues, but we should we should all agree that having a strong, abundant rural America is in the best interest of everybody in America.
Sure.
And so I'm really inspired to see that sort of, and there's a lot of cool bipartisan stuff happening in agriculture now too. I mean, like, for instance, what like one of the things that the Biden administration has done that I would think is a good thing is they appointed Lena Khan to be the president of the FTC, and she's someone who's been aggressively going after breaking up Google and Facebook, and she wants to break up the big meat monopolies as well. And I think, that's something that JD Vance has been a big advocate, and he's actually said that
Sure.
he's very supportive of Lena Khan and her initiative. So to me, seeing that type, and that's really, those are both young people in their 30s that are the future of their respective parties, and to see that type of long-term thinking and that sort of awareness that, we can't allow a Brazilian owned company and a Chinese owned company to be our largest producer of chicken, pork and beef and lamb. We need to have those large, though we needed those to be companies that are United States companies that are, focused on not just the bottom line, but also our nation's health, like our nation's survival. And, there are things more important than money. A lot of things, actually.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, but that's something that gets me. more torque than probably anything we'll talk about, is I hear everybody like, oh man, we got to be careful. We don't want to be dependent on China for microchips. We don't want to be, dependent
Right.
on China for superconductors or washing machines.
Yeah.
For hell's sakes, guys, like, we don't want to be dependent on China to feed our children. That's
Yes.
what we don't want. Like, we'll
Yeah.
deal with the microchips and the freaking washing machines later. But
Yeah.
right now,
Start with
and
food.
nobody talks about it. I
Yeah.
mean, that's what drives me crazy. And to the Republicans' credit, Democrats' credit, whatever. Nobody's talking about it on the national level
Yeah.
from the president's seat right now. I mean, you don't hear him talk about
No, it's
agriculture. It's manufacturing. It's
never
this.
comes
It's
up.
that.
It never comes up in a debate. It never comes up in a poll.
No.
And I'm just sitting there like, how short-sighted can we be? Because
Oh,
it's the most important issue. I think it's more important than military. I think
I
it's yeah,
1,000% is more
yeah,
important than that because I mean, all it takes is people to stop trading with us right now, and we don't feed ourselves. Like, that's
yes.
literally all it takes is China going to everybody else and saying, "Hey, don't trade with the United States, or we won't trade with you." Guess
Yeah,
what?
and
We're in trouble, and we're
the
in
other
trouble right now.
yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The other thing I wanted to say about solutions is too is and our family has taken this to heart because when I started filming documentaries, I was living in the middle of New York City, and as I've been filming and getting to know people and learning about these issues, like I would say it's incumbent upon everyone who listens to this podcast and everyone who understands about uh, what's going on in our country with agriculture. It's incumbent upon each of us as individuals to take ownership of our own food. And so, my
Yeah,
family, we started homesteading in 2019. We raised chickens and ducks and pigs and rabbits, and we have food, so we're covered. There's an old
yeah,
proverb like if everyone sweeps in front of their front step, the whole world will be clean. And it could also be if everyone plants a garden, then everyone will be fed. So I think if you're getting overwhelmed and thinking about a bunch of stuff, oh, what am I going to do? Well, I can tell you what to do. Go out and grow your own food. I mean, that's really
yeah.
what you can do.
Do what you can where you are, because I know, that's not always available to a lot of people, but there's a lot of people that it is. Swap out your flower bed for something worth eating. And I think that's an important distinction to make. The other thing that gives me, and back to the political scene of it, the other thing that gives me a little bit of hope is the amount of tariff bills that came out of Congress this year. The amount of people, especially Ways and Means and Senate Finance, the bills, there have been more tariff bills come out this year than there have prior from 1930 until this year. I mean, so that to me says that they're starting to see it. I don't think they feel the full weight of it quite yet. But I mean, we're talking about shrimp, we're talking about crawfish, we're talking rice, blueberries, beans. The only thing we're doing really well on exports is corn and soybeans. Those are the only two things that we're actually doing well on exports. The rest, we're taking a bath and we're running a huge deficit on it. I mean, the lobster guys in Maine, they're struggling with bringing lobster in from other countries. This is a problem across every industry in agriculture, and they're starting to see it, and they're starting to see some silver lining. And in another episode of this podcast, I've got a trade policy guy that has worked with some people from the Trump administration, and we're going to talk about exactly that. Like, what are the trade policies that are influencing agriculture? Because I think that's an important thing for people to understand. And that kind of brings me to, I wouldn't say the last point, but I think the point that we have to make, and you make this very well, is that we have to tell our story. And farmers and ranchers have not been good at it. They have been very insular. They don't want people on their places. And my family was the same way, but we've had quite a few reporters and quite a few documentary crews come to the place now, and it's just like, okay, we finally realized that the other side's been telling our story for us for a long time, and they've been defining us in a way that's not accurate. And so we have to go out of our way to tell that story and to communicate what's actually happening with people, and to have conversations like you and I are having today to let people understand the nuances, because if we don't put the information in front of them, they're not going to digest it, and they can't do anything about it.
Yeah, totally. And it's so important. I'll also say, yeah, in closing, that like what you've done is really important as far as I think the political sphere is something that farmers have avoided, and I think it's very, very good for our nation to have more farmers representing us because
Yeah.
farmer issues are really important. And I know, like you said when I was interviewing you, a lot of farmers don't want to be going to fundraisers or doing all the press and all the things that kind of go along with being in the political arena. But you've really taken leadership on that front, and I'd love to see farmers, no matter what your political persuasion, if it's Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, progressive, whatever your party is, I think we need more farmers in politics because let's face it, farmers are great people. They're people that are humble. They're people that know that we're part of a larger thing that, uh, and so I think it's a good thing to have our farmers represent us in the highest offices, and I'd love to see what you're doing, and I'd like to see you're continue to do that, and other people who are farming to get into politics as well.
Yeah, and that's honestly, I tell people that the reason I got into politics was because of agriculture, because we went to do something about something that happened, and I had nowhere to go. The industry had nowhere to go. We were up against the wall, and I said, you know what? If we're going to make a difference for agriculture in the future, I mean, agriculture means everything to me. My family's been in this for 6, 7 generations, couple hundred years, well before we even came to America. It's in our blood, and I'm watching it die right in front of us. And I just said, you know what? Somebody has to do it. And I know it's not fun. Cal, people are like, oh, you enjoy politics. I'm like, anybody that enjoys politics is sick because it is not enjoyable, but we have to start looking at it differently. We have to start looking as a necessary evil at this point because you're either in or you're out. You either have a seat at the table or you're eating scraps off the floor. And for far too long, farmers and ranchers have been eating scraps off the floor when they're the ones putting the food on the table. And that's what drives me nuts. And
Yeah,
that's what makes me so upset about this deal is we're putting the food on the table, but we don't put ourselves at the table. And I blame farmers and ranchers for a lot of it. They've gotten so busy, their help's slimming down because of the margins. They don't have a lot of extra time to go do things, but you have to make it part of it and you have to make time for it, whether that's local government, state government, whatever it is, you have to make time for it. Being chairman of the Utah Republican Party, anybody will tell you that is the most thankless and terrible job that anybody could ever do. And I will completely attest to that. But it is so important to get involved, to make these connections, and to help people to understand because agriculture is such an imperative part of our survival in this country. Not only that, when the people are like, well, why'd you run for governor? And I said, we almost got there. We were 2.5 points shy of an incumbent in our convention, and we were right there. And I just said, you know what? Because I felt like it was the right thing to do. And people say, why would you want to do that? I said, no, no, no. You have to reframe that question because anybody that wants to do it has a screw loose. But we're coming to a point in time when we have to because it is going to be, in my opinion, this is the biggest fight we're going to fight over the next 20 years in the United States is making sure that there is food on the table for our kids each and every day.
totally. Yeah, well said.
So, well,
Awesome, man.
thanks for joining me, man. I appreciate this. Been absolutely. It's nice to have a conversation with somebody who gets it and sees it firsthand. You've seen as much or more than I have, and I sure appreciate the work you're doing. So, thank you. Keep it up, and we'll keep in touch.
Anytime, Carson. Have a great day, man.
You too, Graham. Thanks, buddy.